Keith Smith, Real GM, FanRag, NBA. I don't even know where to start. I mean, obviously, the Sixers traded for the number 1 pick, and that seems like the biggest news locally. But, I mean, reports are the Sixers are one team that called the Knicks for Porzingis. I mean, why would the Knicks even be putting him on the market? Are you kidding me? Paul George is going to be traded. Jimmy Butler, Kevin Love. I mean, this offseason in 3 days is better than the entire NBA playoffs.
It's a car movie. It's called Fast and Furious.
No, that was good.
Thank you.
Keith Smith joins us now. Would you say the offseason PT is better than the playoffs? It's been 2 days. You got better stuff happening already. This is awesome.
The intrigue is awesome.
All right, let's get Keith first off. First off, thanks for joining us again, Keith. Let's get your reaction to the Sixers-Celtics thing. It started on Friday. Are you surprised, number one, that it happened and how quickly it went from Friday to Monday?
Yeah, I'm surprised on both fronts. If you had asked me a week ago, I would have told you there's no way the Celtics are going to move the number 1 overall pick. I just couldn't see a reason why they would do it unless it was delivering a true superstar. And then how fast everything came together was also shocking. And what that leads me to believe is there was a reason Boston wanted to push it through so quickly, was so that they could move on to whatever they're planning to do next.
Yeah, we don't see the number 1 pick traded prior to the draft very often. I think it's only happened 3 times or 2 other times total where we already know that another team is going to make that pick, and the Sixers are going to take Markelle Fultz by all accounts. What is your take on the compensation Philadelphia had to give up to move from 3 to 1?
Yeah, I think it's a good move for both sides. I think Philadelphia did what they had to do to get their guy, and they are at a point now where getting as many bites at the apple is not where they need to be anymore. They need to start pushing this forward. They've got a lot of good young talent across the board at many positions. They've got a ton of cap space to fill the remaining holes that they have left. But the glaring need was a point guard. Well, there's a point guard available in this draft, and they did what they had to do to go up and get him.
Yeah, they get Fultz. He fits in pretty nicely there with Ben Simmons. Where would you, because obviously Danny Ainge was saying we don't find him to be the consensus number 1 overall pick. How do you view Fultz?
I have him as number 1 on my board, but it's not by a super wide margin. I do think there's not a lot of separation between Markelle Fultz, Lonzo Ball, Josh Jackson, and Jason Tatum. I feel like they're all a lot closer than a lot of other people think, but I do still have Fultz on top of that group.
Danny Ainge also, they make the pick to get back to number 3, and they've kind of said, look, Fultz wasn't a good fit for us, or we didn't find him to be the consensus number 1 pick. Do you think Boston would have been better off staying in that spot and maybe taking some other offers, or was this the best offer they felt they were going to get?
Danny Ainge said this was the best offer by a significant margin in his press conference yesterday, and he's generally pretty straightforward on those things. So I do believe that this was probably the best they felt it was going to get at this point. He also said the player that they may pick at 3 may have been the player they picked at 1. So I think from the Celtics' perspective, the idea was we can still get our guy and pick up an additional asset. We might as well go do it.
Keith Smith with us talking NBA basketball. And Keith, at one point over the weekend, there was a report out there that Jimmy Butler was being shopped. And if the Sixers, would you have rather seen them stay at 3 and maybe try to get Jimmy Butler for their 3rd pick and some other assets? Or do you think that Fultz was the no-brainer, like they had to go for that?
I'd rather see them do what they did, which was go up and go get Fultz. I think to go get Jimmy Butler would have cost them so much in terms of a package that may have set them back a little bit, because it would have likely cost as much, probably more, in terms of picks and players than it would be to go get Fultz. So I like what they did was go get Fultz. He really fits the timeline of the rest of the roster really well, and it fills a hole. It fills a position of need at the point guard spot. So I think that was definitely the right move.
We're talking with Keith Smith here about all the offseason moves and the things that are still to be. If you're Brett Brown right now, are you over the moon at the way things are shaping out? And do you think that they give him enough of a chance to then work with this young talent?
Yeah, I think he should be extremely excited. He's going to get a good young player, and all indications are they're going to have about a minimum of at least $40 million in cap space. And every indication is that they're going to spend it this summer. They're going to bring in a couple of players who can hopefully come in, mesh with the young talent, and push this thing forward. So if I'm Brett Brown, I'm excited that it's finally winning time. It's development time is over. It's time to start winning.
Now, their space, they have so many guys that we think are going to be back. Who are some of those free agents that you think they're targeting?
The names I continue to hear are J.J. Redick, as far as a need for a shooter on the wing. Shooting guard seems to now be the position of need. I've also heard that they have some interest in Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, he is the restricted free agent shooting guard from the Detroit Pistons. And one of the things I like about that move is even if they don't get Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, what they can do is they can put the pressure on the Pistons to match, and that's a team they need to pass ultimately in the standings at some point. So you put the pressure on them to match a deal and tie up their cap space long term. Those seem to be the two names that are most commonly mentioned.
Yeah, let me ask you, they're going to add Fultz, obviously, with Simmons and Embiid, and if that's a healthy trio, you have Dario, Covington. They've got a couple veterans like Bayless, Gerald Henderson. They like Rashawn Holmes. What is your expectations in this Eastern Conference for that core? I know they're very young, but we saw Embiid really carry them in January. They won 18 more games, and Ben Simmons never stepped on the floor, and Embiid only played 31 games. What is a realistic expectation if they have a healthy core?
Yeah, and that's the key is the health. If they're healthy and they add a good player at the shooting guard, because they've got to add more shooting onto the roster, that's kind of the glaring hole right now, is I think that they can push for close to a playoff berth, but you got to be patient with Fultz and Simmons. You can't go overboard with those two guys simply because they're both rookies. And, Simmons, he had the year of being around the NBA, but he still hasn't played in an actual NBA game. So there's going to be a little bit of patience exercise there. But if they can add the right player alongside those guys, I think they're going to start to push close to the playoffs. Again, with that gigantic caveat of if they're healthy.
Keep in mind, too, Keith, as Pete kind of alluded to, they're going to have, $50 million in cap space or upper $40 million in cap space. I know you mentioned Redick, but do you find that the Sixers would be an attractive destination for a higher-level free agent at this point?
For one of the true superstars on the market, let's say a Gordon Hayward, I don't know that they're quite there yet. I think those guys are going to want to be on a team that's a little bit further on in their development path towards being a contender. But for that next tier down, I think like a J.J. Redick, that's the kind of guy who would come in and say, I can be part of helping get this team to that next stage and still be here as they're developing to be really good. And a guy like Redick is someone who his game should age fairly well because he's really a shooter, and that's what he does, and that usually doesn't leave guys as they get older.
You look back at the Sixers, the divide is unreal. If you were here every day, Keith, and just listened to Sixers fans and anti-Hinkier, you'd be amazed at what it goes on here, how much there's a divide. But you get these people that say, why are you rewarding losing and you shouldn't be rooting for losing. But when you look back at this whole scenario, I know it's taken longer than maybe some people would think or envision, but in basketball years, is 4 years of building a team really all that long?
No, it's really not. It is, especially where Sam Hinkie took over. The team was a mess. He didn't have any assets. He did a great job to get what he got out of the players that he had. And then from there I think what it was the fact that people wanted to see them fill out the roster. Let's look at a team like Brooklyn this past season. They filled out their roster at least with veteran players, but those veteran players, they may have got them 1 or 2 extra wins. But what Sam Hinkie did was he said, who cares about those 1 or 2 extra wins? I'd rather try to catch lightning in a bottle. So I'm going to bring in, 5, 6, 7 young guys and see if a couple of them work out and can turn into rotation players. And now we're starting to see that pan out, especially look at a guy like TJ McConnell. He was brought in on a flyer, and now he's at least at a minimum a serviceable backup point guard in the NBA.
Keith Smith with us. Here's a two-parter for you, Keith. One, does this validate what Sam Hinkie did? And two, will other teams now follow suit?
For the first part, I don't think you can say it validates it yet. They haven't won anything. They haven't even made a playoff game. I know people are already looking forward to buying playoff tickets, but let's see what happens once these guys actually take the floor together. But I think it's getting closer to that validation. And the cool thing is I'm not there, but I see it online all the time, whether it be through Twitter or other avenues. There's a lot of excitement around the team, and everybody seems really jazzed for this upcoming season and to watch this group. As for the second, other teams are already doing it, not to the extent that Philadelphia did, and I don't know that we'll see that because I think the NBA made it quite clear they don't want to see that.
Talking with Keith Smith here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. The second round, Keith, the Sixers have 4 second-round draft picks, and Brian Colangelo has already come out and said there's only so many spots and so many guys we can take. What do you think they do on draft night with all those second-round picks? How do you think that plays out?
I think there's a potential they'll look to package a couple of them together and see if they can either move up higher in the second round, maybe even package a few of them together to grab one of those late first-round picks. A team like Utah has 2 late first-round picks, could potentially be interested in moving one of those for more seconds, or they could do even something where they package a couple for a future first-round pick down the line. That a trade like that happened last year in the draft, so that wouldn't surprise me. If they do keep them, you're definitely going to see them do some draft and stash guys. That's a good opportunity to take a chance on some of the overseas players who aren't going to come over for a year or two, and you can push off to overseas and let them develop over there and then come over when they're ready, and more importantly, when you actually have roster spots.
Keith Smith and, of course, RealGM.com, FanRag Sports, covers the NBA. All right, let's look at some of the NBA stuff. Let's start. I guess there's a report out there about Adam Zagori over at Zag's blog has the Phillies, the Sixers, the Suns, among other teams that have contacted the Knicks regarding Porzingis. How did it get to this point that they would consider trading this guy?
Yeah, it absolutely should not have. I have no idea what the Knicks are doing. It's insane to me. You have a 22-year-old who's 7'3" and every single thing you want in a basketball player, including being signed for 2 more seasons before he's even extension eligible. So it makes absolutely no sense that the Knicks would listen. From all other reports, they have set an extremely high asking price for Porzingis that it doesn't sound like anybody's willing to meet yet. But so I find it hard to believe they would actually trade him. I think what they're looking for is some team to say, we'll offer you this ridiculously over-the-moon package, and then maybe they would move on it. But until that point comes, I think Porzingis is staying right where he is, which is really how it should be.
How about with the departure of the Cleveland GM? There was talk about a possible 3-way trade, Kevin Love, pieces, Sixers having pieces. Does that departure then change some things?
I don't know that it changes things so much. I don't know how much you guys saw the story, but the story was up until almost 6 o'clock that evening, David Griffin, who's now the departed GM, was working on the framework of a trade and then was dismissed in the middle of those negotiations. That's how the story goes, which is really unfortunate. He was also missed out on opportunities to interview for other GM jobs because Dan Gilbert wouldn't let him. It was just not handled well by Dan Gilbert. But as far as the trade, what this actually could do is increase the chances of a trade because it sounds like Chauncey Billups is going to come in and run the team, and he may be looking to put his stamp on the team and build his roster. So sometimes when that happens, a new GM wants to do something really quick to make their name known and to make it their roster. So we could see that increase the likelihood of a trade.
How about Paul George? He's been the topic of discussion. Does he play in Indy this season?
I really don't think so. I think they will hit a point where they have to take the best offer available, because it has been made very clear to them that he will leave at the end of this coming season. He will not be there, and at that point they're going to lose him for absolutely nothing. And that's not something, when you're the Indiana Pacers, you're not a free agent destination. You can't afford to have that happen. So I do think more likely than not, at some point this summer, they will take the best offer on the table and trade Paul George.
Keith Smith, RealGM.com, FanRag Sports NBA. The NBA offseason wild. By the way, we talked about Porzingis. There's a report that said the Knicks reportedly offered Porzingis to Phoenix for Devin Booker and the number 4 pick in this year's draft. So I'm like baffled that the Knicks are like, and they think Markkinen's going to come in there, and I mean that's the name. It's just fill that role. Like you're going to find another 7'3" guy, as you kind of alluded to, Keith. I'm just baffled by some of these rumors. I mean, Phil Jackson and him must completely have something wrong with each other, right? I mean that's got to be the only thing when you hear that the Knicks actually are calling teams and saying we'll give you this.
Yeah, I think you always have to be careful this time of year to find out who actually called who and who made what offer. But it really is at the point where it sounds like that relationship has gone really south. One of the reports that's out there today is that they have not even talked since the end of the regular season. Any communication he's had with the team at all has been through his teammates, Willie Hernangomez and Mindaugas Kuzminskis. So that's not good, that your best player, your franchise cornerstone, isn't even talking to your team at this point. It's really a sign of things are bad in New York, and what they may be looking to do is completely just wipe it out and reset around all new fresh blood. But again, Porzingis that's not the guy you need to be shipping out to reset around.
Keith, let me loop back to a couple of names I mentioned already, Paul George and Jimmy Butler. If George ends up on the Lakers and Jimmy Butler maybe to the T-Wolves, if they both get traded to the Western Conference, what does that mean for the landscape of the Eastern Conference moving forward?
Yeah, I think if Chicago and Indiana lose Butler and George respectively, they're going to be hard pressed to be playoff teams and probably have no shot at it. So what that does is for teams like Philadelphia, Miami, that missed out on the playoffs, that should vault them that much closer to being playoff teams this coming season, because I don't think there's enough talent left behind, nor would they bring in enough talent in replacement of those guys that they could possibly be playoff teams next year.
Jimmy Butler, is he at the point now where he doesn't want to be in Chicago?
He's been pretty quiet throughout this whole thing. Even last year at the trade deadline, whenever asked, he was, I'm a Chicago Bull and I'll be here and do what I need to do to help this team win, kind of that canned athlete speak. So there really hasn't been much that has come out from him. But I would be surprised. It has to be hard on a player, and I know it is from talking to multiple players and agents, when all you've heard now for really basically a 4-month period is your name in trade talks. So at some point that has to wear on him, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he does come out and say, you know what, I'm ready to move on. If you don't want me here, let me get somewhere else that does want me.
Hey, who's more likely to leave the Clippers, Paul or Blake?
I would have said Blake Griffin up until today when the San Antonio Spurs started clearing cap space left and right. If anybody hasn't heard, Paul Gasol and David Lee will both opt out of their player options. Gasol is going to leave over $16 million on the table by doing so. But the idea is that he's doing that to then sign a more team-friendly deal, which to me says the Spurs are clearing the decks to make a big run, and the obvious logical target there is Chris Paul. So I think they're going to push all in to go get him. And it may be time that Chris Paul says, it's not going to happen here in Los Angeles, even if we all come back together. At that point, then it becomes everybody should go, because they're not going to be able to replace him with anybody even near comparable.
How about that other basketball team in Los Angeles? Will D'Angelo Russell be a Laker at the start of the season?
It sounds like there's some interest in him, but I do think he will be there. I don't think the Lakers are ready to move any of their young talent. From anybody I've talked to that's close to that situation says Their plan is we're just going to hang on to these guys because there's no reason to move any of them, and then we'll do our shopping next year in free agency, which link it all together. They're not going to openly say it because he's on another team, but that's Paul George. There's no reason for them to trade players to go get Paul George when they believe we can just wait a year and sign him, and by that point our young guys will be a year better and a year improved.
Hey, what's this Griffin move do for LeBron's future? I mean, do you sense now that his time in Cleveland is running out?
Yeah, I think it might be. There were all the reports in the last couple of weeks that he wants to play in Los Angeles, and then there were reports that his wife wants to live full-time in Los Angeles. And, I can tell you, the reason we live in Orlando is my wife wants to live full-time in Orlando. So happy wife, happy life, right? So I think that is getting really close. So it is interesting that this comes up. And he came out in support of David Griffin last night and said, I have your back. You helped us get a championship to Cleveland. And that it doesn't bode well for Cleveland. Let's just put it that way.
All right. Very busy NBA offseason shaping up. And by the way, keep in mind, the draft is Thursday night, and then free agency will get underway. And we're already hearing all of this stuff. Keith Smith, Real GM. You can check out the Front Office podcast. And, boy, I'll tell you, Keith, you guys are busy with this NBA stuff. There is a lot of stuff to kind of sniff out. We appreciate the time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And just remember, it never stops.